It is 9:04, so I am going to start this webinar and hand the reins over to Zach in just a moment. First, I really wanted to thank everybody for joining us. This is the first out of 3 webinars we're putting on, and I really wanted to bring our clients information about the labor shortage. So this first one is just research. It's Zach. He is at the Agricultural Resource and Economics Department at UC Davis. He ran a really recent study that is only in California, but it's got nationwide implications. And I think it's just the sort of research I want my clients to be on top of. Because next week, not next week, sorry, at the end of July, we have another webinar coming up. I'm going to bring you 3 different stories from 3 different farmers who made the switch to our tools and also did other changes. And they're going to talk about the changes that they made and what the outcomes have been, so you can get real life stories from real farmers. I've got a vineyard and a nut grower lined up. I'll probably also share a story from a kiwi grower. So these are really interesting people who were losing money before or in a lot of pain before, and you're going to hear what they actually did and how it worked out. So, but today is all about Zach. So I'm going to turn the reins over to Zach. And he is going to show us his research. All right.
Today, I'm just going to really be sharing some of the research that I've covered over the past year or so as I've been working on my PhD in agricultural and resource economics. So I'm going to start by covering some farm labor force statistics, and then I'm going to cover some highlights from recent research that has come out that is providing evidence that the farm labor supply is shrinking. In addition, I'm going to explain some factors that are linked to the declining farm labor supply. And then I'll be covering some results from a recent survey of California farmers that I conducted in conjunction with the California Farm Bureau Federation in January of 2019, which was aimed at gaining a better understanding of how farmers are adapting to farm labor scarcity. So so there are about 1.3 million U.S. farm workers, and about 475,000 of those are in California. And so 73% of the farm workers are immigrants, and in California the number is a little bit higher. It's actually 90% in California. And of the immigrant farm workers, 90% of them are from Mexico, and a little bit more in California. And so 62% of the immigrant farm workers are undocumented, and also the farm workforce is aging. So as of 1990, the average age of a farm worker was about 33 years old, but in 2016, that age had risen to about 39. In addition, the farm workforce in the United States is settling down. So evidence of this can be seen by how long farm workers have been in the U.S. So as of 1990, the average farm worker had been in the U.S. for about 10 years. But as of 2016, that number had risen to about 19 years. So now I'm going to highlight some of the research that I've come across over the past year or so as I've been researching this subject. And there's been a handful of academic studies that have been trying to figure out what's going on with the farm labor supply. As you can see here on the right, this has made the rounds among the media, where farmers have been reporting evidence of farm labor shortages off and on for about a decade now. And the academic research suggests that fewer farm workers are actually willing to migrate to work on farms, that farmers have been reporting increased labor shortages, particularly at harvest time, that farm workers are increasingly engaging in non-farm work, and that immigration policies are driving workers away. So why is the farm labor supply shrinking, and is this decline in farm labor supply temporary? Is the decline in the farm labor supply temporary? Well, the answer to the second question is that no, the decline in the farm labor supply is not temporary. And the answer to the first question, why is the farm labor supply shrinking, is because of a variety of reasons. So there are factors both in Mexico and in the United States that are contributing to the declining farm labor supply. So for example, in Mexico, there are falling birth rates, which means that there are going to be fewer farm workers available in the future. But in addition to that, the Mexican economy is expanding, which is drawing workers out of the U.S. farm labor supply. So not only is the Mexican agriculture economy, the agricultural, that there's more competition for farm workers, and the expanding non-farm sector means that that's drawing workers out of the farm labor pool. In addition, there's higher educational attainment among the rural youth in Mexico, which means that the young people are not following their parents into farm work like they once did. On the U.S. side of the border, non-farm work is pulling workers out of the farm labor force also. So farm workers are being attracted to better working conditions, higher wages, and the opportunity of having year-round employment off of the farm. And this is drawing workers out of the farm labor pool. But fewer farm workers are also migrating with the crops. So this means that the farm workforce is aging and is not being replenished by young immigrant workers, as I already mentioned. But farm workers are settling down in the U.S. They're having children, and workers want to stay close to their family, so they're not following the crop like they once did. In addition, tightened border security means that there are higher coyote fees, which are smuggler fees. So that means fewer workers are coming to the U.S., or they need higher wages than farmers are willing to offer in order to pay off these smuggling. So it's likely that farm wages are going to continue to rise. And so I recently did a study with Professor Ed Taylor at UC Davis and Professor Diane Charlton at the University of Montana. And we actually estimated how high wages would have to increase over the next 10 years just to keep the same number of workers that are currently in the workforce. So I'm going to ask you guys, I'm going to turn it over to you here in a second. I'm going to ask you to respond by how. Okay, I'm just going to reveal the answer here. The answer is, according to our study, that farm wages would have to rise by at least another 30% over the next 10 years just to keep the same number of workers in the workforce that are there today. So now I'm going to cover some of the highlights from a recent study that I did with the California Farm Bureau Federation in January of 2019. So we conducted a survey of over 1,000 California crop and dairy farmers, and we asked them questions about labor shortages, wage increases, farm labor contractor and H-2A visa use, changes in acreage, labor-saving technology use, and changes in cultivation practices. Now, this survey was aimed at just trying to get a better understanding of how farmers are reacting or adapting to the increased incidence of farm labor shortages and labor scarcity. And so I'm going to share some of the highlights of this survey with you. So one of the questions we asked was, during the past 5 years, have you ever been unable to hire or to obtain all the workers you needed for the production of your main crop in your main county? And so participants were allowed to select yes, no, or I don't know. And of those who selected yes, we also asked them, during which of the years have you experienced a labor shortage? And so as you can see here, on the left side of the graph here is 2014, and as you move to the right, it moves towards 2018. So in 2014, about 13% of the farmers replied that they had experienced a labor shortage at some point. And then as of 2018, that number had increased threefold to about 41%, indicating that the incidence of labor shortages are becoming more common. In addition, we asked another question, which was, during the past 5 years, have you had to raise wages in order to attract enough workers for the production of your main crop in your main county? And then of those who selected yes, we asked them, during which years did you have to increase wages to attract enough workers? Again, we can see the same pattern starting on the left in 2014 and ending on the right in 2018. So in 2014, about 30% of the farmers indicated that they had to raise wages in order to attract enough workers. But as of 2018, that number had jumped to almost 80%, indicating the same pattern, which is consistent with these labor shortages. Then we asked a question that asked farmers, during the past 5 years, have you had to change cultivation practices? And then we asked some follow-up questions to figure out which years they had to change cultivation practices and what the reasons for changing those cultivation practices were. So an example of a changed cultivation practice would be like reduced or delayed pruning or weeding, or in some cases, farmers responded that they had to reduce or delay harvesting as well. So you can see the same pattern here. On the bottom, we have 2014, and on the top, we have 2018. So in 2014, less than 10% of the farmers said that they had to change a cultivation practice because of labor availability issues. But as of 2018, that amount had increased to over 30%. So about 1 in 3 farmers said that they had to change cultivation practices because of labor availability issues. In addition, we asked a question about technology, labor-saving technology use. So specifically, we asked, during the past 5 years, have you had to use a labor-saving technology that reduced your reliance upon labor? And so then for the farmers who selected yes, we asked them when was the first year they started using the technology, and then what was the reason for having to use the labor-saving technology. So this graph here shows the answers, the reasons why farmers chose to use a labor-saving technology. And you can see that the #1 answer here on the left is that they used the labor-saving technology because of rising labor costs. But then the second most common answer was because there were not enough workers, indicating that labor issues are a big reason why farmers are having to use labor-saving technologies. Then we asked a follow-up question, which was what type of labor-saving technology reduced your reliance upon labor the most? And so the farmers responded that mechanical harvesters and specialized tractor attachments were the #1 and #2 answer. But then you can also see that pruners, suckerers, or leafers, mechanical planters, and updated irrigation technologies were also relatively common types of technologies that were being used to save on labor. So that's all I really have to share with you at this point. I'm going to pass it over to Ananda. Ananda, do you have any questions?
Well, actually, what I'd like to do is really open it up to the group. I promised everybody that they could ask you their burning questions. So what I'm doing right now is I'm unmuting everybody and just turn it over to you guys. Does anybody have a question for Zach? I mean, he is the lead, one of the lead researchers on this study. So kind of a rare opportunity to chat directly with the man himself.
I have a question.
Okay, is this Kathy or May?
Hi. I really appreciate this study because it really highlights what I have been experiencing in the farm. But I wonder if you have spoken to any government agency, labor agency about this problem, and are they going to do something different? Such as implementing, you know, the H-2A visa is great, but for small farmers, it's just very hard and costly to implement.
Yeah.
Is there any, you know?
So I personally have not been in contact with government agencies about this, but I do know that the California Farm Bureau Federation, who we partnered with on this study, has been an advocate for improving the guest worker program. They've been working very hard on trying to improve the program, making it easier for farmers to be able to use the program. So, so the short answer to your question is no, but the California Farm Bureau Federation is working on this issue as we speak, yeah.
Okay, is there a point person? You know, we don't want to hound our senators to death about, you know, these things. They're busy enough. Is there a point person that we can, you know,
Right.
Drop an email to?
So I do not know off the top of my head who would you would talk to, but I can put you in contact with our contact at the Farm Bureau, and they will definitely know. So if you wanted to send me a follow-up email after this webinar, I could connect you with the Farm Bureau contact who would be able to assist you with that, or point you in the right direction.
Sure, great, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Does anybody else have other questions they'd like to ask Zach? Because if not, I actually have a question. You know, Zach, I read your full study. Zach has just given us the major highlights here, but the full study I'm going to email to everybody after this is also really interesting. And one of the things that it made me wonder was if Mexico is having falling birth rates and they are in the long run not going to be a good labor source for us, and what are they doing for their farming? And one of the things I learned is that they are having a labor shortage and that they're importing labor. So I wondered, Zach, do you have more information about that?
Yes, I do. I have some limited information about it. In fact, I'm going to share the next slide in my presentation here, which is just going to highlight some of some aspects of this. So, so in on the left part of the screen, you should be able to see. So there's two graphs on the screen. The leftmost graph is a graph of about 100 countries in the United States, and on the vertical axis is the percent of that country's workforce that works in the agricultural sector, and on the horizontal axis is the GDP per capita, which is a measure of wealth. And so the beginning of the arrows are where the country started in 1991, and the arrowheads are where those countries ended up in 2017. And importantly, you can see that almost all the arrows point downward and to the right, which is an indication that as countries get richer and go through the development process, their workforce tends to transition out of agriculture. Now, typically what's involved in this process is the use of immigrant labor for the home country's agricultural workforce. And in fact, if you focus on the right part of the rightmost graph, I've isolated Mexico and the United States on these graph, and I've rescaled it so that we can see them a little more clearly. And you can see that the U.S. is more or less transitioned out of farm work, but Mexico is falling right behind the footsteps of the U.S., and they're also transitioning out of agricultural work as well. And importantly, what's underlining this process is that Mexico is also starting to import labor from Central America to work on their farms. So this is an indication that in the long run, Mexico is not going to be a secure source of labor for the United States, and that the U.S. is likely going to have to start figuring out how to produce more food with fewer workers, which typically is going to have to involve the use of technologies.
Well, that's so interesting. And you know, I did see an answer come in earlier when you asked your question. You said, you know, by what percentage does the wage have to increase over the next, what was it, 10 years for us to keep the same amount of labor? And I saw somebody guess 10%, and I think the correct answer was 30%, right?
Yeah, exactly. So not accounting for inflation, the wages we've estimated will have to rise by at least 30% more over the next 10 years just to keep the same number of workers in the workforce. So yes, that's correct.
And that right there to me is really why I wanted to invite everybody who's here today on this webinar, because I think that anecdotally I mean, you've shared with us that you're experiencing it on your olive farm, but I know that all of my clients are sharing stories like this, but I don't think a lot of people realize the true magnitude of what's going on. Because, I mean, Mexico importing labor is something that I didn't know about, and I think a lot of my clients didn't know about prior either. So just kind of amazing times that we are living in.
Yeah.
Well, is there anybody else who would like to ask Zach a question? All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Like I said, this is just the first out of 3 webinars we'll be leading. The next 2 really start focusing on what can you do about this. So here's the big problem. We know it's not going to stop. Let's find out what we can do about it. The second webinar is coming up at the end of July. Like I said, we're going to bring you real stories from real farmers, find out what they really did to solve their issues. And obviously my tools are part of that puzzle, but they've also done other things, so we're going to find out from them. And the third webinar in August is actually going to look at how do you calculate how much money you would save each year? How do you actually get to the ROI? I am an Excel loving fool, and I will show you how I do it with my clients. And everybody who attends that webinar will also have the opportunity to meet with me one-on-one and get a free, basically consultation and figure out with you, using your real numbers on your farm, how can we figure out how much money this could save you? So that's the next 2 webinars. We're going to figure out what we can do about this issue. Thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you on the next 2.